So let's consider three essential figures from the turn of the century in modern photography: Alfred Stieglitz, Edward Steichen, and Paul Strand. All of them important at the same period of time, but their importance stretched on a whole lot longer than that. So, first, to distinguish these three figures that are important to remember, when you think of Stieglitz, think of him as the visionary figurehead. He was the founder of the Photo-Secession, he was the publisher of camera work, and he was the curator of modern art at 291. Edward Steichen, and he was sort of a contemporary and rival figure to Alfred Stieglitz, and they worked together, but they had some different ideas about things. Think of Steichen as the comprehensive master. He was a leading figure in pictorialism, but then he went on to be a war photographer in World War One. After that, he went into media photography, and he became the curator of photography at the Museum of Modern Art up until the 1950s, so a very long career. When you think of Paul Strand, think of him as the young disruptor. He started out in photography young and at an early age became a sort of protege of Alfred Stieglitz. And with his bold new ideas about abstraction, he managed to strongly influence Stieglitz, who by turn converts his movement and his followers towards thinking of sharpness and abstraction as essential elements of what makes photography modern. So that's Stieglitz, Steichen, and Strand. Now, Alfred Stieglitz. So we've looked at him as the leading figure of the Photo-Secession, the director of the Photo-Secession. Let's consider his work in photography. In photography, he valued unmanipulated photographs with a pictorialist feeling, but with a more modern perspective. He valued the use of the handheld camera because that allowed him to move around in society and capture things that were actually happening in the world. And that was what felt like what modern meant to him. He was inspired by repeating graphic elements and patterns, and you see that a lot in his photography. And his photographs were predominantly reproduced as photogravures in camera work. So this is typical of his street photography in New York City in the 1890s. This one's called The Terminal, New York. You can see it isn't really romanticized. It has some atmosphere to it, but there's dirt and there are horses and streetcars and people working. It's a normal, everyday scene of life in New York City, but it has this sort of boldness in composition that makes it feel fresh and modern for 1893. Alfred Stieglitz took many photographs of the architecture of New York City, and these are reproduced using those really fine printing techniques that make them look like beautiful, elegant, rarefied pieces of art. Now, the steerage is a photograph that he was especially proud of. This is kind of a legendary photograph that came from Alfred Stieglitz, photographed in 1907 and was reproduced a few different ways. So what's modern about this, okay, what we know about ships coming from Europe to the United States during this period in time, wealthier people got to be on the upper levels of the ship. The poorer people were confined to the more crowded lower levels of the ship. And what you see in this photograph, in the upper area, there's a lot of people, but in the lower area, you see a lot of messiness and sort of reflections of daily life. There's laundry hanging on lines. There are women holding babies, and there are people kind of leaning every which way towards the bottom. And then there's this sort of these bridges that connect the lower area to the upper area. There are repeated geometric elements in the form of a stairway coming up on the right and a gangplank kind of coming in from the left with these repeated chains. So these repeated planes that sort of structure the depth of the photograph connect it to what's going on in painting at the time. So that feels very modern and very connected to the world of art for Stieglitz. And at the same time, it's reflecting the reality of the social world and what's modern in the social world, the reality of immigration and life in New York City. So it's art and it's photography, and it's very modern. So this is Alfred Stieglitz's The Steerage, and it's really emblematic of what photography is really aspiring to do at this time. Alfred Stieglitz's later photography moves more dramatically towards abstraction and sort of elemental compositions. This is from a long running series that he called Equivalence, where he was just photographing clouds without explanation. And these become equivalents for psychological or emotional states, but they're not narrative and they don't tell stories. Now, we know about Alfred Stieglitz that he had a long relationship with Georgia O'Keeffe. She came to him when she was a young, ambitious painter, wanted to exhibit in his gallery. And that wasn't something that women artists were doing at that time. So she was bold in taking that step, and he was bold in seeing what was so important and meaningful about her paintings. He gave her her first New York show. And the two quickly became partners, and they stayed partners for life for 30 plus years after that. He made many photographic portraits of her over their long and somewhat tumultuous marriage. So, this is the kind of painting that Georgia O'Keeffe is best known for. She spent many, many years making paintings that were sort of abstractions from life. A lot of them were paintings of flowers. So she'd take these small details from flowers and paint them very, very large, so that as an experience of a painting, it's about how light works with these shapes and colors and textures that are created by the petals. So it's from life, but it becomes much more abstract when it's taken up into a larger painting. In Alfred Stieglitz's photographs of Georgia O'Keeffe, they have that sort of bold, elemental approach to composition, and that sort of spirited quality of Georgia O'Keeffe's persona that really brings them to life. Now, in addition to Alfred Stieglitz's role with the Photo-Secession and with camera work and with his photography, he had a very strong influence as a curator. Curators have the ability, because of their connections in society, because of their connections to the art world, because of their ability to put pieces together and sense what the public wants, they can influence people, what they see and how they think about it. And that's what Alfred Stieglitz did. So his Gallery 291 had the objective to hold together those Americans devoted to pictorial photography and exhibit the best photographers. Before long, that gallery transitioned to include groundbreaking European art, including Picasso, Matisse, and Cézanne, who were all shown for the first time in the United States at that gallery. Here's an installation view of 291 at its early times when it was called the Little Galleries of the Photo-Secession. So in this installation view, you can see how the photographs were hung very close together and not very large by the standards that we have these days. We're used to seeing art photography go much bigger than that. So it's interesting to just see how differently things were hung back around 1910 when this photograph would have been taken. So when 291 transitioned over to showing modern art, it had its own publication. This was after the years of camera work when 291 moved on as a gallery, and it showed the works of these of these modern artists like Man Ray, who you see on the left, and a sculpture by Picasso that you see on the right. Those were published in the publication called 291 after they were shown in the gallery 291. After the years of 291, Alfred Stieglitz had another gallery called An American Place, really embracing American painting and abstraction and putting that in front of the American public in New York City. So there you see a view from my window at American Place, the photograph by Alfred Stieglitz on the right, and on the left is showing Stieglitz in his later years with one of Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings.